Technology is everywhere, and so should a systematic philosophical reflection on technology. The Working Group on Philosophy of Technology, WGPT, at the University of Leuven in Belgium aims to create a platform to do precisely that. You're listening to WGPTalks, a series where we give the opportunity to our own members to talk about what fascinates them at the crossroads of technology and society. Today we talk with Ann-Katrien Oimann on AI in the courtroom. No one likes to be confronted with the law, not only because of the potential consequence, but also because many believe it to be slow, inefficient, and even arbitrary, unfair, biased. So, what if humans are replaced by computers, algorithms, AI? Can we have an algorithm as a lawyer, a robot as a judge? Today, I'm here with Ann-Katrien Oimann to discuss these issues. She is a doctoral researcher at the KU Leuven and a member of the working group. And she's doing her doctoral research in collaboration with the Royal Military Academy Department of Behavioral Science. Her project focuses on AI actually in military use, semi-automatic weapons, etc. But besides that, she's also interested in the use of AI in law and legal reasoning, which will be today's topic. So welcome, Ann-Katrien.
Hello.
Let me immediately start with the following question. I think most people, when they hear about these dreams of using AI in law, will think that it is fiction, nothing that really exists yet. Is this true?
Well, that depends on how you phrase AI in the legal sphere. Certainly isn't fiction. It's already there in multiple ways. For instance, AI is used to help citizens, to help the judge, and to help lawyers or attorneys also. On the other hand, people also tend to think that AI is something, or AI in the legal sphere is something new, whereas the idea of implementing AI in justice systems exists since the 1980s, really. And there also, they investigated the possibilities of the introduction of judicial decision-making, and more fundamentally, whether AI would ever be able to match human reasoning also.
So it's already there from the 1980s. So what were they trying to do?
At first, basically, they focused mainly on rule-based systems. So how to mimic the reasoning of judges, of lawyers into these systems. But it was rather rigid, like almost like logical systems. If this happens, then this is the result. Whereas now we have implementations of machine learning, etc. But in the beginning, it was mainly focused on these rule-based systems. And that's not new. I mean, that's something that we already have since the 1980s. So the question of what's possible in the legal sphere and can we mimic legal reasoning is rather old.
But was it successful? I don't see robot judges in the courtroom.
No, in the beginning, it was, I think, more like an academic or theoretical thing. But now we see the results of that. I mean, we have support systems, we have predictive algorithms, we have sort of autonomous systems. So now we see the results of their research and their theoretical discussions back then.
So what is the difference between these three things you mentioned? Support systems, predictive systems, and autonomous systems. What should I imagine with it?
I think in general, you could indeed make a distinction between, or what's now state of the art. You could say, well, there are mainly three big categories. First, you have support systems that are really there to support humans in processing large amounts of content-related info. And examples of that include legal research services that help lawyers find relevant legislation and case law. You also have the public safety assessment tool in the US used by judges that use them when ruling on a defendant's pre-trial detention. But you also have support systems really for citizens. For example, in Flanders in April 2019, there was the introduction of online chatbots to provide legal advice to citizens. And they called them Robin, Marie, and Victor, which was quite funny. So on the one hand, you have support systems content related. You also have systems that are being used to get more insights into the processes. Like what's the general time frame when I go to court versus when I come out? What's the throughput time of cases? And also how many cases are being done by certain courts, stuff like that.
To make it more efficient.
To make it more efficient, precisely. You also have predictive algorithms that really attempt to predict the outcome of legal cases. And there you already starting to have these questions, how good are these cases? And there is evidence that these predictive algorithms are fairly good. But what people tend to forget is that if you have an efficiency of these systems of 60%, it's not much better than throwing a coin. So there you already see some difficulties. And on the other hand, you also have these kind of autonomous systems, whereas autonomous is not really the right term, but that is introductions of systems where AI is not used as support systems, but that the AI really makes the decisions.
What would be an example of such a semi-autonomous system?
I think you have two. One is, it exists for a couple of years now, are these online dispute resolutions being used in the Netherlands, for example. They call them e-courts there, where it was really algorithms making decisions because they were fairly basic cases under 7,000 euros. It was systems that made the decision, and human judges were only there to formally put a stamp on it. And on the other hand, you have the proposal by Estonia, where the Ministry of Justice said, well, we want to introduce these autonomous systems where also a bit like the e-courts, like, well, you upload all your files, the system give an output, and there's no human in the loop, so to speak.
And the idea is then, again, that would make the whole legal process more efficient. If we can do more cases in less time because we do not need all these judges, etc. That's probably one of the typical advantages that proponents of AI in the legal sphere would propose. But are there other advantages? Why should we use AI in courts anyway?
I think typically you could say that the advantages in courts are not so different of the advantages of using AI in other spheres. The typical arguments are that these systems are better, faster, and more accurate. And you see the same arguments here where they say, well, these kind of systems don't make mistakes, they don't need sleep, they can handle much more amount of data than humans can, and they are being more accurate. So that's one thing.
So you're saying that AI in the courtroom would be faster and better, etc. But what is so problematic then with human lawyers and humans in the courtroom? Why are they not better than AI?
I think one interesting fact is that if you look at the trust that citizens have in the judicial system, then we see, if you compare it with police or even the parliament, that we have a problem, at least in Belgium and Flanders. There was empirical research on it, stating that, well, the trust of citizens in the judicial system is rather bad. So I think one possible solution would be to increase that trust, because AI systems have the advantage of being more consistent. If you ask a normal person, what's your problem with the judicial systems, you often hear the argument, well, the fact that if I go with my case A to judge B, then I get a result C, whereas I go to another judge, I get a completely different outcome. Mm-hmm. And intuitively, that seems not fair. I think one of the advantages of AI in the legal sphere could be an increase of this consistency in similar cases. So that on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that judges are sometimes subconsciously biased. And the fact that you introduce AI, you could have the potential to put this subconscious bias out.
So in that sense, and using AI, not only because it's faster and more efficient cost-wise, etc., but also because it seems at least fairer, it excludes kind of arbitrariness or inconsistencies and biases. But is it really the case that these AI systems then are free from all biases? That they are purely objective, they're always consistent, etc.?
No, and I think I'm very glad that you asked the question, because indeed, I put it now as if these systems are purely objective. But first of all, these systems are programmed by humans. So they're the ones still, they have an important role in designing these systems. So there you could have possible discrimination and bias already. On the other hand, if you have systems like machine learning, that are being trained on historical data, and this historical data contains bias, well, then you also have problems. And I think that's, for me, the most interesting one, is that often we train systems and it seems like, okay, we have these perfect neutral variables. Like in recruitment, you have, for instance, a variable of uninterrupted years of service. And at first sight, hindsight, it seems like a perfect neutral or objective variable. But in a second instance, women often have lesser years of uninterrupted service. So what the system learns is put all the women away or exclude all the women.
Do similar problems arise in the legal sphere?
In the legal sphere, we saw an example in the US also where we had bias against Black people because of historical data consisting predominantly male Black people. So the system was biased against Black people. And on the other hand, you have also the bias based on, for example, where people live or districts or zip code, which also at first hand sight seems like a neutral variable, like zip code. So this also seems at first hand sight like a neutral variable, just like these uninterrupted years of service that I mentioned. Still, the system also learned that people from a certain district had higher probabilities of being a criminal.
And these were typically then poor sections of town, for instance.
Yes.
Or where predominantly Afro-Americans
lived. Yes, exactly.
So there are clear forms of biases still at work in AI systems used in the legal sphere. But is that the only disadvantage of AI systems, or are there other reasons why we shouldn't be too hasty to introduce these systems everywhere?
There are also other ethical and legal problems. And I think the main things where these problems arise are in these so-called black box systems, where you have problems of motivation and transparency. You don't have that much in traditional knowledge-based systems where you could really trace the outcome back. But with these black box systems, you don't have a fully transparent system. And what you want, at least because in the legal sphere, that's such an important domain, systems have the right to know how a certain outcome was reached or how a certain decision was made. And there you have the discussions of how big should this transparency be, or where should a citizen get the insight? Should it be insight into the algorithm, whereas a normal citizen doesn't know anything maybe about algorithms? But it's really important that citizens have insights into how the decision was reached. And that's a problem with these kind of systems. And on the other
Why is it a problem? I mean, I could say the way how a judge thinks is also a black box for me.
In a way, I agree, because we also don't know exactly how a judge or what goes on in his or her head. But you could have the possibility to ask, or at least a judge should put his reasoning on paper. And you don't have that reasoning with these AI systems or with these black box systems. It's not possible to trace it completely back. And that brings me also to the second disadvantage, or to the second problem, and that's the problem of motivation. A judge often makes reasoning based on certain factors and motivates his or her decision. But if you have a completely autonomous AI system, for instance, it just gives you an output and you have no idea how the conclusion was reached.
Could these problems not be solved in the future? And maybe there are. Maybe nowadays we don't have a system that is fully transparent or cannot produce a kind of motivation, but I can imagine we will come up with systems that will be capable to give such motivation and that will be transparent enough to make these problems disappear. Would it then be the case that if these problems are solved, we should all have robot judges and AI as lawyers, etc.?
I agree. I completely agree. These arguments like transparency and motivation that are often being given are not fundamental arguments, precisely because what you mentioned, the argument can always be given that in the future, maybe it's possible to solve it. And then what? And for me, there still is one, I would say at least one fundamental argument, and that's the problem of the rigidity of the legal system. Algorithmic decision-making systems, by definition, can only consider factors that they have seen before. And unlike the judge, such systems cannot ask itself questions about the nature of legal rules it must apply, for example. It can choose between all sorts of arguments and indicate why a particular punishment should be imposed in this case, but it's unable to think more fundamentally about, for example, the method of repressive enforcement. So I think what's important is that to ensure good justice, it's essential to incorporate the dynamics within society. And I don't see how we can incorporate these dynamics without humans, because these systems only learn from data that they already have seen before.
So what then is precisely the capacity that is missing? Because it seems to go towards a kind of more philosophical point about what is the difference between humans and a machine.
Yes, I think that brings us back also to the discussion about the difference between autonomous systems and these so-called robot judges, where you say, well, are these robot judges just like humans? And then you must say no, because these systems lack or don't have the capacity to reason or don't have meaning. And John Searle has a very good explanation of it in his so-called Chinese room experiment, where he says, well, there's a difference between human understanding and machine understanding.
So, and what is this thought experiment? Can you explain it? John Searle's Chinese rooms thought experiment?
So the idea is that you have two people, one sitting in a room, the other person outside the room, and the person outside the room only speaks Chinese, whereas the person in the room, for example, let's say only speaks English. And the person outside the room asks questions in Chinese to the person in the room. And the person in the room is able to answer the questions because he or she has a whole staple of dictionaries and a manual that states, well, if this is being asked, then this is the translation, etc. So for the person outside the room, it might seem as if the person in the room has a complete understanding of Chinese. Mm-hmm. But if you ask us, I mean, I would say that the person in the room doesn't speak Chinese and doesn't have an understanding of what he or she is exactly doing.
So the idea seems to be that it lacks meaning. There's just bits of data, doesn't really understand what it's saying. And the same would then apply to these legal AI systems, that they might look from the outside very much like humans, but they're only mimicking it. But on the one hand, that seems to be just a very abstract question on what is real intelligence, real consciousness, and these kind of things. But you seem to suggest that there is also a more practical effect of that difference here. In the form of, you mentioned it, that the AI system is trained based on the past, whereas humans are somewhat more capable of anticipating future events or dealing with totally new cases.
Yes, I mean, as humans, we can look at certain cases and only imagine something completely new that are not bound by, of course, also bound by certain input or information that we get, but we can reason in a more new way, whereas these systems are really stuck to their past information.
So in a way, the question is then also, and again, that's quite a philosophical question here, what is then legal reasoning? What is the specificity of legal reasoning in opposition to other forms of reasoning? Because I then seem to get the impression that the issue might be that these AI systems follow a certain, you could call it a certain form of reasoning, but one typically more associated with classic logic or science even, just very mathematical, whereas legal reasoning has a kind of specificity that is different. And that is, well, the risk is that will be lost if replaced by AI systems.
Yes. So the first classical view of legal reasoning assumes that judges reach a certain decision through a rational application of legal rules to a particular circumstances. Mm-hmm. Like deontic logic, for example. And according to that formalistic model, judges decide on the basis of prevailing law and are not guided by their moral considerations. And that's also the idea that citizens, and also even in law school it's taught, that there's a strict distinction between the law on the one hand and morality on the other hand.
It's like the same Chinese room almost. They have just a book with rules. You have the input of the citizen or the lawyer, and they just look up the right response and they respond in kind in that sense. That's the idea.
That's the idea, precisely. But a couple of years later, you had the legal realists that said, well, these classical positivist view must be abandoned because judges can't distance themselves from personal preferences, and they really saw a link between law on the one hand and morality on the other hand. So it's not only rules, but also these additional factors that come into play. And I think that's also how we should look at the law today. It's not just the pure application of rules, it's really applying rules to a certain case. And in a way that makes sense because the law or the manual that judges use, they are abstract rules, but they can't foresee every situation. So it still is the judge that must apply these rules to certain cases.
This legal realism at first seemed to be a very descriptive claim. Like if we want to capture what judges, lawyers, etc. are doing, then legal positivism is inadequate because judges do not follow these strict protocols. They are also always affected by moral and other factors. But I can imagine again that the proponents of AI would precisely say we have to make legal positivism real, in the sense that we have to get these moral factors out. But you seem to suggest with the opposite, that legal realism is not just descriptively right, but even normatively, morally right to practice law. We shouldn't want to be the picture that legal positivists describe, pure robots in our judgments.
I think indeed you should always look on a case-by-case basis, and that's not possible with these logical legal positivists view. So humans or citizens or legal subjects have the right to get a decision based on their specific case.
Then again, the issue might be that, as we said before, these AI systems are typically trained on massive amounts of previous cases, and they just try to reproduce what is done in the past. They do not question the past. They do not ask whether it has been done right in the past. They do not look at the individual case.
Precisely, because then if a judge looks at your case, and you could say, well, okay, the AI system has these rules on the one hand and these data based on previous cases, well, maybe your case is something new and you don't have a judge looking at that. You always have the system that only looks on historical data, and that doesn't seem fair to me.
It's part of this seeming unfairness also linked then that people are just always offended when they are treated as numbers rather than as persons. So that you have this, again, very moral, philosophical notion of personhood there, which seem to be at play, obviously, in the law as well, that we have to treat these individuals as persons, not just as things, not just as random objects or something, not just as numbers, but each case should be taken seriously as a person, as an individual, etc.
Yes, and I think especially in these kind of domains, like, for instance, the law, and that's also, I think, the reasoning that you see with the new AI regulation, where they make it a distinction between high-risk domains and low-risk domains. And what they did is precisely focusing on these high-risk domains, and that are things like the legal sphere, like police, etc., that are so important, where they say, well, it must be a human that looks at these kind of cases, or at least a decision can't be reached solely by an autonomous or by an automated system.
So it's not an accident that both of the empirical cases you mentioned of Estonia and of the Netherlands only involved very low risk, very low stake elements, just fines, not prison sentences or something like that.
Yes, I mean, the proposals of Estonia and also the e-courts in the Netherlands came before the AI regulation, but I think that is also the idea behind it, that you could say, and it makes sense, a lot of cases that we see below a certain threshold are similar. And why not implementing in an AI system for these kind of systems that are always the same outcome, but you do have certain complicated cases where it still needs to be a human that looks at the case. So I think indeed that was reasoning behind it. Let's divide them into categories and say, well, for these highly complicated cases, we still need a human overview.
So in some cases, AI might be helpful. In other cases, we should be more wary. So AI in the courtrooms does not seem to be the holy grail, but nonetheless, there seems to be, at least by some actors, kind of push towards this. Should we be worried about this? That they see AI as the solution to all our problems?
Yes, I think there are, obviously, we also mentioned a couple of them, you have advantages. There's a possibility that these AI systems increase consistency in similar cases, etc., and that they point to unconscious bias, etc. But on the other hand, you want to ask yourself the question, as with all implementation of technology, well, is technology or are these AI systems the answer to these kind of problems? Maybe I'm just thinking out loud, but maybe the solution isn't the implementation of AI systems, but maybe the solution is more education of lawyers, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that some problems that exist in the legal sphere are actually not technological problems or cannot be fixed by technology. But that typically seems to be the easy option. We don't have to structurally change anything. We just have to introduce a new AI system that will magically solve our problems. In most of the cases we talked so far, we tend to focus on these autonomous or semi-autonomous elements where the AI systems replace the classical legal way of doing it. But as you mentioned before, there are also uses of AI as a kind of support systems. Shouldn't we almost by definition be in favor of these things? I mean, there's still a human in the loop. AI systems just give extra information, they help, they make perhaps a prediction of what the outcome is typically, and then the human can still correct. Wouldn't that be the perfect use of these AI systems, or are there still issues there even with these support systems?
I'm tempting to say, well, these support systems are a good idea. They're just the next step. First, you had statistical information, and now you have more sophisticated AI systems. The only thing is where we must be careful is that these support systems don't become de facto decisive systems.
What does that mean? Why would they become de facto the systems making the decisions?
Well, there is empirical research that suggests that judges are also, or in general, people are influenced by the outcomes of algorithms because they say, well, these systems are better, are faster, are more accurate. Who am I to say that this isn't right? And they tend to trust the systems. And because of the increase of trust in the systems, often they say, well, the system must be right. So they submit to the system.
So it's kind of intimidation then. The computer says A, it probably knows best, so I should just agree out of kind of conformity.
Yes, and there again, it's what comes into play or what's important is really also education, that you say, well, lawyer, this is how the algorithm works. This is how the algorithm reaches a certain conclusion, and be careful because the system is only trained on historical data, etc., etc. So I think if you would implement these supportive systems with enough knowledge or education to judges, for example, then it really might be a good solution because judges or attorneys must process so much data. These AI systems definitely could be beneficial.
Lawyers, judges, etc. should also have some courses in AI and technology and how it is used specifically then in the legal sphere. Perhaps to conclude, kind of an open question, given all these issues and at the same time that it is present already, nonetheless, how do you see it evolving in the next, let's say, decades? Will it increase? Will it always remain marginal in the legal sphere? Or will we indeed systematically face robot judges, so that there is literally not a human there in front of us, but a computer?
I would say that we would see in the next couple of years an increase or even more an increase in supportive systems, definitely on the one hand, and also these autonomous systems. In certain easy cases, so to speak, I think we would also see systems that decide for themselves and it's not the human anymore. I think what we see in the next years is that humans or human judges really spend their time or more time on these important cases. I think that's the way to go. On the one hand, I don't think that we will see robot judges in every case, definitely not. Part because of regulation. We see the new AI regulation coming. We have the GDPR that has, or also human rights. So we are bound by certain parameters, and that's a good thing. So I don't think that we get these completely autonomous systems. I also don't think that we want that.
So are you optimistic or pessimistic about future of AI in the legal sphere?
I would say both. I mean, for the supportive systems, we have good systems. Why not use them? And they could increase consistency, etc. But on the other hand, we also must be very careful because we are dealing with complex AI systems, often black boxes, and we must be careful and ask ourselves the question, where do we want to implement it? And is AI the right tool for that?
Many new insights. AI in law has been already there. It's not fiction anymore. At the same time, it can play many different roles. Some of them, as in the supportive systems, are probably for the good. Others are more dubious. We might really indeed ask ourselves a question, should we replace judges by AI? Will that indeed solve the problems? Are there not other alternatives? Many thanks, Ann-Katrien, for the many insights and this fruitful conversation. I learned a lot. probably we will see each other in the next episode to talk about your current PhD project. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you for the invitation.